that thou art mindful of him, and the Son of Man that thou dost care for him. The NRSV rendered this as, what are humans that you are mindful of them, mortals that you care for them. The NRSV changes man to human. However, the New Testament quotes this passage in Hebrews chapter 2, and the author of Hebrews assumes that Psalm 8:4 is a prophecy talking about a specific male human, Jesus. That reference comes through loud and clear in the RSV by using the words man and son of man, but it's lost in the NRSV. The scholar Bart Ehrman, who himself is a fan of the NRSV and uses it in his teaching, criticizes this translation decision, saying this passage is not talking about exalted humans as a race, the way the translation now indicates. It is speaking specifically of the superiority of Christ, a particular man/son of man. But there is no way the English reader can know that. As a result, in fact, the passage in Hebrews no longer makes any sense. All this to say, no translation is perfect. I don't want to be taken here as an NRSV booster, it has its issues. But in the end, most scholars today prefer the NRSV mostly because it contains fewer partisan or sectarian readings compared to other translations. Next, we have the English Standard Version, or the ESV, which was published in 2001. Like the NRSV, the English Standard Version was a revision of the earlier RSV, but the ESV was produced with a very different goal in mind. From the start, an evangelical editorial team explicitly set out to produce a translation that appealed to theologically conservative Christians who hold views such as biblical inerrancy or traditional gender-based limitations on authority, the belief that only men can hold certain positions of authority within the church and in the household. By the late 1990s, most of the evangelical world had already rejected the NRSV as too liberal, but in late 1996, word got out that another popular evangelical translation, the NIV, would publish their own gender-inclusive version. This triggered a gigantic backlash from certain corners of the evangelical world. For example, the theologian Wayne Grudem, who I already mentioned, co-authored a book criticizing gender-inclusive language, titled The Gender-Neutral Bible Controversy: Muting the Masculinity in God's Words. Although the NIV's publisher eventually backed down, Grudem and others decided to make their own translation. They set to work systematically amending the 1971 version of the RSV. In a 2016 interview, Grudem stated their mission: "We took out all the traces of liberalism and updated the RSV." Since gendered language was a primary motivation for creating the ESV, let's look at a few examples. Sometimes the ESV only changes a single strategic word, as is the case in a passage in 1 Timothy chapter 5, a letter that claims to be by the Apostle Paul, but the majority of scholars argue was composed by someone else. In 1 Timothy 5:14, the author instructs his audience how to help widows, saying that younger widows should remarry and start new families. The RSV reads, "So I would have the younger women marry, bear children, rule their households, and give the enemy no occasion to revile us." That phrase, "rule their household," is rendering a single Greek verb, oikodespoteo, which is a compound word from oikos, meaning home, and despoteo, meaning to rule or to be a master of. So the verb quite literally means to rule a household. It's a strong verb. You can see the English word despot in there. In his analysis of the ESV, the sociologist Samuel Perry notes that this translation potentially gives the idea that young married women are exercising considerable authority in their homes, possibly even over their husbands. So it's perhaps telling that the ESV changes only this verb, to manage their households. A markedly less powerful sounding translation that suggests young wives are merely managers of the home where men still rule. Another example appears in Romans 16:1. In this verse, Paul mentions a woman named Phoebe who presumably delivered the letter to the Roman church. The RSV reads, "I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deaconess of the church at Cenchreae." Paul calls her a diakonos, which can mean servant, but it's widely understood by scholars to indicate some sort of administrative or official position within early Christian communities. Specifically, he calls her a deaconess at the church at Cenchreae, which strongly suggests that she held some sort of position of authority in this community. However, the ESV translators chose to translate that same word as servant, closing off the potential interpretation that she held any formal position of authority. Interestingly, elsewhere in the letters of Paul, the ESV editors translated that exact same word as minister. In another instance, the ESV translators actually added a word that does not appear in the original text. In 1 Timothy 3, the author describes the qualifications for deacons. He writes, "Deacons likewise must be serious, not double-tongued, not indulging in much wine, not greedy for money." And then the text says, "Gunaikos likewise must be serious, not slanderers, but temperate, faithful in all things." Gunaikos can literally mean women or wives. Does the author mean female deacons or wives of the deacons? The NRSV says, "Women likewise must be serious," and includes a footnote flagging the possible alternate translation, wives. The ESV, on the other hand, inserts the possessive pronoun, their wives. which does not appear in the original Greek, but it does solidify the interpretation that the verse is referring to the wives of the deacons, and limits any possible interpretation that women may also be deacons. This is a good example of why literalness is not a clear benefit or should be taken at face value. Wayne Grudem argued that every single word of the Bible in its original language is spoken to us by God, and thus he set out to create what he called an essentially literal translation. But in the case of the ESV, conservative evangelical identity politics seem to be shaping the translation, and sometimes supersedes a more literal reading. Now, to be fair, translators of any sacred text in any religion are always making decisions about what a text is meant to say for their own community. But when those decisions align so clearly with a specific subset of Christian thought, I would not recommend that translation for the critical study of the Bible, or even to readers outside of that particular community. Turning now to another popular translation, the New International Version, or the NIV. Published in 1978, the NIV is one of the top-selling Bible translations of all time in any language, and like most contemporary translations, the NIV relies on critical editions of the original languages. And the NIV's translation philosophy falls more on the dynamic side of the spectrum. From the start, the NIV was an evangelical project. It was sponsored by an evangelical organization called the International Bible Society, since rebranded as Biblica, which still holds the copyright to this day. The NIV's translators represented several different evangelical denominations and were recruited from evangelical seminaries, universities, and organizations like the National Association of Evangelicals. Like the ESV, the NIV explicitly was designed to appeal to a conservative Protestant audience, though this was not a secret. The translators shared their doctrinal commitments in copies of the NIV itself. For example, the 2005 edition says the translators were united in their commitment to the authority and infallibility of the Bible as God's words in written form. The translators were in fact required to subscribe to particular statements of faith. These motivations, of course, are not ones that all scholars can share. As the scholar Jason Badun says, creedal commitment has nothing to do with linguistic skill or other necessary criteria of accurate translations. In other words, signing a confession of faith may work for the in-group, but for a scholarly translation, if you're aiming to assemble a translation team of experts, their religious identity should not be the primary concern. So here are a few examples of this conservative evangelical perspective in the NIV. In Ephesians chapter 2 verse 3, the NRSV says, "All of us once lived among them in the passions of our flesh, doing the will of flesh and senses, and we were by nature children of wrath like everyone else." By comparison, the NIV says, "Like the rest, we were by nature deserving of wrath." The NRSV is more literal. It translates the word children with the modifying word of wrath. So the NIV's choice to add the word deserving is quite a stretch, but it's a choice that aligns better with some conservative Protestant theology, emphasizing the inherent sinfulness of humanity and that people deserve eternal punishment. 1 Peter 4:6 is another example, though it's a notoriously confusing passage. The NRSV sticks pretty close to the original Greek, for this is the reason the gospel was proclaimed even to the dead. Does this mean someone can be saved even after death? Well, many Christians say yes, but evangelicals not so much, and we see this evangelical perspective in the NIV, for this is the reason the gospel was preached even to those who are now dead. As in, they were told about the gospel before they died, which precludes the notion that post-mortem salvation is possible. A similar tendency shapes the NIV's translation of the Old Testament. For example, scholars have long recognized that Genesis contains two creation accounts. One runs from Genesis 1:1 to the first half of Genesis 2:4, and the second from the latter part of Genesis 2:4 to the end of chapter 3. One of the key differences between these two creation accounts is the order of creation. In the first account, humans are created last, but in the second account, one of the first things that God does is create a man and then plant a garden for him. Genesis 2:7 says God creates a man, verse 8 God plants a garden, and then in verse 19 God makes animals, because the man is all alone. Most English translations leave this tension between Genesis 1 and 2 unresolved. It's pretty unambiguous. The NRSV even includes a heading, another account of the creation, halfway through Genesis 2:4. However, the NIV alters the verb tenses in chapter 2 to make it sound like events that happen in sequence are actually out of sequence. God creates a man, but then God had planted a garden, and God had made animals. The use of had implies that these actions occurred earlier, as in God created the garden and animals before humans, even though there's not much textual basis for this translation. But it does reflect an attempt at harmonizing the different sequences of Genesis 1 and 2. So like the ESV, I do not recommend the NIV for the critical study of the Bible, and it should be considered an in-group translation for conservative Protestants. Though the NIV is even unpopular with otherwise respected scholars within Protestant Christianity, such as the Anglican scholar N.T. Wright. In 2009, he wrote about how he grew increasingly disillusioned by the translation as he went through the letters of Paul. He says, "Again and again with the Greek text in front of me and the NIV beside it, I discovered that the translators had another principle. To make sure that Paul should say what the broadly Protestant and evangelical tradition said he said." Okay, we've been talking a lot about Protestants, what about Catholics? Let's turn now to the New American Bible. Originally published in 1970, the New American Bible is the only English translation of the Bible authorized for use in Catholic liturgy in the US. It was produced in response to a papal encyclical issued by Pope Pius XII in 1943, called Divino Afflante Spiritu, or Inspired by the Divine Spirit, which fundamentally revolutionized Catholic biblical studies. Before this, Catholic Bible translations were primarily based on the Latin Vulgate, a Latin translation of the Bible produced by St. Jerome in the late 4th century. While the Vulgate was and is a vital part of the Catholic Church's tradition, Pope Pius XII encouraged Catholic scholars to produce translations based on manuscripts in the original languages, and use historical critical methods of interpretation. This meant that the Bible should be studied in light of new archaeological discoveries like the Dead Sea Scrolls. So the NAB, as with other modern translations, is based on critical editions. The translation team featured mostly Catholic scholars, though a few Protestant scholars participated as well. So we saw with the NIV and the ESV that the specific theological goals of the translation team found their way into the text. So what about the NAB? Is it a uniquely and particularly Catholic translation? Let's take a couple of examples where we might expect the differences between Protestant and Catholic theology to shape the translation. One of the best-known disagreements between Catholic and Protestant interpreters is the Catholic teaching of the perpetual virginity of Mary. According to Catholic tradition, Mary had no other children after Jesus. She remained a perpetual virgin. For Protestant denominations, that's generally not the case, and they believe that Mary birthed other kids after Jesus. So what does the NAB do with a few verses that complicate this teaching? The Gospel of Mark, chapter 6, verses 1 through 3. He departed from there and came to his native place, accompanied by his disciples. When the Sabbath came, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astonished. They said, "Where did this man get all this? What kind of wisdom has been given him? What mighty deeds are wrought by his hands? Is he not the carpenter, the son of Mary, and the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?" You're not reading that wrong. It sounds like Jesus had brothers and sisters, and the NAB just literally translates the Greek as brother and sisters. This is virtually the same as the ESV and the NRSV. No sugarcoating, no attempt at trying to shape the translation to match the doctrine of Mary's perpetual virginity. But the NAB does include a long footnote. The footnote explains three things. First, it points out that in the Hebrew Bible, the terms brother and sister can be used for family one step removed, like cousins, nieces, or nephews. Second, it notes that while usage can't be taken for granted, it's clear that in the same chapter in verse 17 that the gospel uses brother for Herod's half-brother Philip, and so the verse could be referring to half-siblings. Third, it concedes that it's possible that the author of Mark takes brother in the literal sense. And finally, the key sentence. The question of meaning here would not have arisen but for the faith of the Church in Mary's perpetual virginity. From this, we learned something important about the New American Bible. The translation team took adherence to the text very seriously. Even though the idea of Mary's perpetual virginity is crucial, the meaning of the text is debatable. They make the decision to keep their version within the reasonable range of meanings of the original text, rather than introducing a questionable doctrinal translation. But they do provide some arguments and counter-arguments in the footnotes. And in general, that's the way the New American Bible works. It follows a similar philosophy to the NRSV, a historical critical approach trying to use the tools available in biblical scholarship to communicate what the text most reasonably meant in their time. But what it adds alongside the text, like in the footnotes, what scholars might call its paratextual philosophy, is much more Catholic, and its scholarly commentary is often quite doctrinal. And this is consistent throughout the NAB. What about Isaiah 7:14 and the translation of Alma? Sure enough, the NAB is in line with the consensus of Hebrew philologists, translating it as young woman, without further commentary. What about Psalm 8:4, where the NRSV arguably tripped up? Look it up in the NAB and it reads, "What is man?" So a little less emphasis on gender inclusivity. What about the verb tense problems introduced by the NIV in Genesis chapter 2? No hint of it, which translates the events in sequence with the simple past tense. There's first man, then garden, then animals. This is not really surprising. Catholic teaching is not particularly concerned with textual inconsistencies, and has a long history of pre-modern Christians who dealt with those inconsistencies head-on, like St. Augustine. Okay, so far we've focused on Christian translations, but obviously Christians are not the only Bible translators. We've been talking so much about the Septuagint, the Greek text used so heavily by ancient Christians, but this was an ancient Jewish translation for Greek-speaking Jews. And we've already mentioned the Targums, ancient Jewish translations from Hebrew into Aramaic for the benefit of Aramaic-speaking synagogue communities. The long history of Jewish translations of the Hebrew Bible was a point made by the editors of the Jewish publication Society Tanakh, a translation of the Hebrew Bible into English which was published in 1917. Scholars more often use the phrase Hebrew Bible, but Jews call it the Tanakh. See, Jews arrange the collection in three main sections: the Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, the Nevi'im, or the prophets, and the Ketuvim, or the writings. Take the initial Hebrew letter of these 3 sections and you get the acronym Tanakh. The original editors of the JPS noted that Jews have for millennia learned to live in places where Hebrew was not the majority spoken language, so they've made translations: Greek, Arabic, German, and more. By the early 1900s, the US had become home to the largest population of Jews in a single country outside of Russia, and so it was time for an English translation. Now, just like all the other versions we've been looking at, a committee drafted the JPS, though unlike Christian translations, as you might expect, the editors paid close attention to Jewish interpretive tradition. They made an active choice to work from the Masoretic Hebrew as their primary base text. As for their translation philosophy, the JPS editors say explicitly that the job of a good translator is to make the Hebrew intelligible. This means the dynamic use of English idiom wherever necessary. So far, fair enough. But as the chief editor of the later